Biological Realist, a podcast dedicated to exploring the impacts of evolution on human mind and society. And before getting to today's podcast, I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to support the show. There's a couple ways you can do this. First, by buying any products through any of the Amazon links on the site. Especially, I draw your attention to that widget up at the top that sort of pops down when you go to any page other than the home page. There's actually a little arrow. You can make it go up and down as you please. But if you search for any of the books that we discuss in the podcast, or any other book, or any other product for that matter that you'd like to buy on Amazon, by buying it through that link, at no extra cost to yourself, you can support the show. Because even though it costs exactly the same for you to buy it through that link as going directly to Amazon, by going through the link on my site, you generate commissions for me, for the podcast, from Amazon, which helps support the show and keep it on the air. The other thing is we're going to have a variety of options to make donations that will be there in the right-hand column. They're going to change over time, but there will always be some options there to make donations. So if you'd like to make a donation, or as I say, at no extra cost to yourself, simply buy products through the Amazon links on the website, especially that widget on the top. That'd be a great way to support the show, and it would be very much appreciated. Okay then, so let's get to today's podcast. Hello, I'm Michael McConkie, host of the Biological Realist podcast. And today I'm joined by Mark Flynn, who is the professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri. So, Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about the ideas of Richard Alexander on the emergence of human nature and sociality. And you were not just an observer or student of Alexander, but you were a collaborator with him, and you also knew him personally. So I thought maybe to get started, you could introduce yourself to the listeners and maybe say a bit about your background and interest and how you came to know Richard Alexander and, you know, the Richard Alexander that you knew. Would that be good to start?
That'd be fine. So it goes back a very long ways. My family background, my dad was in the Manhattan Project and got out of it, but physics and chemistry was pretty much the area of my family, and I was kind of a black sheep in having an interest in medicine. So I had the good fortune of meeting a beautiful woman who was Richard Alexander's daughter in high school, and we got married. And my interest in going to medical school changed in part because, I don't know if it was a date or what, but we went to a lecture by William D. Hamilton, Bill Hamilton, very famous evolutionary biologist.
Well, that's a good date.
He talked about extraordinary sex ratios. And I just left that lecture stunned, mentally, stunned that a theory, in this case evolutionary theory, could explain such cool stuff. I was used to the world of physics and the world of medicine, which is bland and mechanical by way of comparison. And so, oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, anyway, I thought I had my...
You're very popular today.
Yeah, people just don't realize. Yeah. So,
it was such cool stuff you were being able to explain through Hamilton's theory, right?
Right. Yeah. You know, that was just such a fun, exciting area to get into. So I got interested in evolutionary biology and worked more and more closely with Dick, which was, boy, just an intellectual dream. And his graduate students, you know, they just accepted me in spite of my naivete and lack of experience. And so I got to go out on field projects with looking at ground squirrels and wasps and all sorts of things. But Dick took me a bit under his wing, and his real passion was to understand humans, how humans got to be so unusual, so unique, the intelligence, the kinds of intelligence, the sociality that we have. And so I decided to postpone entry into medical school and take a brief foray into anthropology. I was especially captivated by an anthropologist at the University of Michigan at the time, a guy named Napoleon Chagnon, who was famous for having studied the Yanomamo. And as luck would have it, Chagnon left Michigan, went to Penn State. And so I was at Michigan for a year in graduate school, and then by the end of that, I was just so in love with anthropology that I decided to run off to Penn State and work with Chagnon. And that was a wonderful time. And I eventually went back to Michigan on a postdoc to work with Dick Alexander and Bill Hamilton some more. And that's kind of my background intellectually anyway.
I didn't know that you studied with Chagnon. That's probably a whole other, I should have you back on to talk about him too, because that's a whole other area of discussion too, isn't it?
Yeah, he was
a fascinating guy.
He was my PhD advisor, and I actually got him to come here to the University of Missouri now, and so we have a collaborative group working on that Yanomamo database, testing
great.
a lot of the ideas that Alexander and others have about human sociality. So it's a fabulous interdisciplinary mix. Very happy.
Okay. So let's get into these Alexander ideas then. So I'm gonna try and give like a brief summary here in a nutshell, just for the sake of the listeners, and you can grade me at the end. It can be a B or a C or whatever you think it is. Correct it if you want, and then we'll break it down into the details. So I'm going to say something like, at some point in the past, our ancestors came to dominate their ecological niche, resulting in the situation in which it was other conspecifics, so let's say for sake of ease, let's say other humans, who start exerting the primary pressures of evolutionary selection that give rise to specific human traits. And so the kind of organisms we are, the way we relate to each other, arises directly from this domination of the ecological niche. Is that about right? Is it sort of a real thumbnail sketch?
Yeah, I think it's important to just look at the balance, and also to be a little more specific about areas of selection. So in regard to the human brain, for example, we're very intelligent and we're good engineers, but what the features that really stand out are social features: communication, language, social scenario building, empathy. And those are not traits or attributes that would have evolved if the primary selective pressures on intelligence were the physical environment, the traditional hostile forces of nature that Darwin identified. So yeah, it was an increasing importance of the social arms race, getting along with other humans, being more socially clever than your peers. And in combination with a gradually diminishing importance of, in regards to selection on the brain in particular, of the physical environment. So yeah, we became increasingly clever at being able to get food in different places, being able to protect ourselves from predators, keeping ourselves warm, all of those things. So when we look at how humans got to be human, particularly the extraordinary, unique attributes of our intelligence and sociality, it wasn't so much about dealing with the physical environment as it was contending with the social environment.
And this is because we had reduced the impact of those traditional forces of nature that Darwin had identified, and so what influenced our success was more going to be our interaction with each other, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, it's the relative importance. It's not like Darwin's hostile forces of nature went away, but
yeah,
compared to the intensity of selection in regards to the brain in particular, that's coming from the social arms race.
And I'm going to so arms races have come up a few times in previous podcasts, so I'm not gonna, we won't explain that. We'll assume for now the listeners know what we mean by that. So so how does this ecological dominance come to exist? Do we have a picture about the timeline of this, or or what features of our ancestors made this possible?
That's a great question for human paleontology. So
right.
Looking at the fossil record and the archaeological record, that's two sources of information we have about our ancestors. We can also look at our close relatives, chimpanzees, to get a sense of how we've changed. And there are some very important pieces of the puzzle. And for example, looking at our distant relatives, the Australopithecines, it's clear that they were fully bipedal for a long period of time, millions of years, before there were any significant changes, certainly at least in terms of the size of our ancestors' brains. So for 2-3 million years, we were fully bipedal and yet had a brain about the size of a chimpanzee. No change, no significant changes. Small changes, but it wasn't until 2 million years ago or so that we really began to see this meteoric increase in cranial capacity in humans, and associated with that complexity of things like tools, stone tools that preserve. That's a little misleading. So Darwin, for example, suggested that tool use might have been the key selective pressure on humans, because you can see that in the archaeological records, stone tools preserve. But the complexity of social relationships, that doesn't fossilize very easily. So the evidence that we really need for changes in the patterns of social relationships and changes in the underlying machinery of the brain that allowed for increasingly complex human sociality, language, mental time travel, empathy, consciousness, self-awareness. Those special, unique human abilities are very difficult to pinpoint. The genus that's identified as Australopithecus into our genus, the genus Homo, there's some pretty significant trends that start to emerge. One of which is the beginning of reduction in sexual dimorphism. So males and females begin to be a little more similar. Females get bigger. The brain starts to get bigger. Tool types begin to get a lot more complex. In the range, that this is when our ancestors really begin to move out of Africa and close in by Africa into lots of other parts of the world. So there's some pretty significant things that start to roll roughly around 2 million years ago. And between 2 million years ago and now, the precise dating of some of the things we'd really like to know about are unfortunately not precise at all, partly because It's just difficult to identify the traits that we're really interested in terms of complex sociality and certain kinds of cognitive abilities from what's available in terms of the fossils and the archaeological record. So it's very difficult to infer things like complex language from the paleoanthropological record. So we have to be clever with using other sources to try and put as many pieces of the puzzle in place to get to a reasonable path from a bipedal ape to a modern human with all our remarkable cognitive, emotional, social abilities.
So it's interesting. So we don't really know that you can't really tell the story, but we're sort of inferring the story by reverse engineering, working backwards and saying this is what must have been the conditions given given where those conditions led us to. Is this what we're saying?
Partly.
Okay.
And there are a lot of pieces of the puzzle, and unfortunately we don't have time to
No.
all of them.
Yeah.
Other things that on the face of it seem to be not clearly related, but with Alexander's model in particular, I mean, one of the really strong features of Alexander's ecological dominant social competition model is that it makes a lot of predictions and a lot of risky predictions. A lot of pieces of the puzzle have to fall in place in the right way. So for example, humans are unusual in having menopause. Humans are unusual in having cryptic or concealed ovulation. Humans are unusual in having grandparents that invest heavily in their grandchildren. And on the face of it, you might say, well, yeah, those things are interesting, but what do they really have to say about human evolution, and in particular, evolution of human intelligence? And Alexander, his model requires a relationship, a complex relationship among a bunch of traits like that to explain the kind of evolutionary pathway that humans came down. So menopause, a long childhood, concealed ovulation, grandparenting, these are all components of change where humans transitioned into this relatively long-lived, very large-brained species that has complex sociality. And the contrast, for example, with chimps, it's very difficult to get a chimpanzee male to invest in juveniles. The reason is because their mating system is such that it would not pay a chimpanzee male in evolutionary terms of evolutionary currency to be parental, because there's no reliable way of ascertaining which offspring are his and which aren't. Humans, on the other hand, have relatively exclusive mating relationships, and it's remarkable that we can live in large groups, large multi-male groups, and maintain relatively exclusive mating relationships. We have these nested families. And concealed ovulation seems to be a very important trait that enables that kind of sexuality and sociality where humans can have their biparental investing family structure and form complex alliances and coalitions, partly based on kinship, but also partly based on mating relationships. So key difference between ourselves and chimps is a human male can go to the group next door and talk to the guys there and form a coalition. So two villages can form an alliance to attack a third village. Chimpanzees can't do that. A chimpanzee male that tries to go to another community will be killed by the males in that community. Humans not only can go over and talk to other groups, they can make complex ties with those groups, in part by mating or marriage arrangements. So one of the ways in which traditional human societies network with other communities is by exchanging marriage partners. So you've got kin over there, they've got kin with you, and you're both aware of it. Another unique, unusual thing about humans as primates, and probably as mammals, is that there are important brother-sister relationships throughout one's lifetime. So even if your sister lives in a different village, a different community, you still have a connection with her. And that's pretty important in many respects. It greases the wheels for alliances between communities, and it certainly changes the dynamics of extended kin networks that can invest in human children.
Okay, so so that's good. So I just going back to the earlier part of what you said for the interest of listeners, I'll create a link to the article that you co-authored with Gary and Ward, which covers a lot of that, all that stuff you were talking about around hidden ovulation and menopause and the helpless childhood and all. It sort of integrates all this into an explanation. So for listeners, I'll link to that article. It's pretty good on all this. Now, so your discussion so far has brought us sort of to the question of the kind of sociality that grows out of the fact that we've come to dominate our ecological niche. And one of the phrases, I think you use this phrase, I'm pretty sure Alexander uses it, that we've become, and maybe I have to clarify this for the listeners too, I'm not talking about cannibalism, but other humans have become our primary predators. And I don't mean cannibalism, we mean that they've become the main challenge to our fitness interest in this social setting. So can you elaborate upon that?
That's right. So as humans became increasingly successful, competition over good places to live increases, and the competition is not with other species so much, it's with other groups of humans. So in order to stay in a really good spot with lots of food and lots of water and just a great place to be, you have to be able to exclude, to defend it against incursions from groups of other humans who might like to be there. And it's difficult to do that unless you're really good at forming complex coalitions and alliances.
Yeah, and this comes back to where you were making the distinction between us and chimpanzees, that they're not able to do that. So we've evolved the capacities to engage in these kinds of cooperative behaviors. But isn't the other side of it? And I think that I'm quoting you, not quoting, but referencing you properly, is the idea that not only, because on the face of it, and I mean, a lot of people who refer to Alexander emphasize this idea that we cooperate to compete with other groups, and sort of a discussion we've been having so far is along those lines. But it seems to me also, and I think I'm reading you properly in interpreting it this way, that but even within those cooperating coalitions, there can still be competition in there too. I mean, there can be disagreements about the leadership of the coalition or what direction or who we should make an alliance with, this sort of thing, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like competition and cooperation are nested. I think your term is, you talk about them being nested into each other, almost in a cascading sort of way. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to your previous terminology, I think Alexander uses the phrase humans increasingly became their own principal hostile force of nature. Their own most important selective pressure. So dealing with other humans, particularly in regard to the evolution of the traits we're especially interested in, the mind, the human brain, but a suite of other characteristics as well. The reason why humans have a brain that's three times bigger than chimps and all that has to do with, apologies, has to do with contending with other humans. So, and the way in which you deal with other humans is not as an individual. I mean, you do that in some circumstances, but increasingly it requires support of larger and larger groups of allies. And that's a tough one to pull off. So, there's a certain egalitarianism, a leveling effect, where to get support from others, you can't be too selfish because they won't support you. It's not in their best interest to do so. You have to make it, you have to forge relationships, a bargain, if you will, in which your allies benefit, as do you. So that really levels the kind of individual selfishness that might otherwise prevail, and certainly that we see characteristic in our close relatives. I mean, chimpanzees are amazing in that they can form border patrols and they can, go attack other communities. But the level of their abilities to cooperate are limited.
And I guess the other angle of this is that we know from the research of people like, I'm not sure I get his name right, Dan Ariely, I think it's pronounced his name. Yeah, we know from his research that given the opportunity within certain circumstances, modulated by the specific circumstances, that almost everyone will cheat or lie to get some advantage, right? So we're always tempted to the free rider. We've got this circumstance where we benefit immensely from cooperation and presumably have all these evolved adaptations to make us successful cooperators, and yet there's always the potential to benefit from free riding on others. So this is part of what I find fascinating about Alexander's work. Is it seems to me he captures that dynamic much better than anyone else whom I've ever read. It seems to me the old sort of social biology stuff seemed to be really biased towards conflict and competition, but I feel like in recent years there's sort of a bias towards cooperation. I thought that Alexander sort of, from my reading of him anyways, however jejune or according to my own priors that may have been, I saw him as really capturing the dynamic of these processes of cooperation and competition constantly being a choice for people, and we're always being challenged about what is the right choice to make. And this also, right, brings into the whole question of self-deception, so that we're not revealing to others that we're being so calculating about the decisions we make.
Oh,
Does that sound right to you?
Absolutely. What selection favors is a facade. So what you want to do is present a face to others, the social world, that causes them to behave towards you in the ways that benefit you. And that's a very challenging task, put it mildly. The whole question of what is honesty and how do we know what is truth? It's very difficult, very dicey stuff. Alexander's book, The Biology of Moral Systems, is remarkable in terms of the way it can cause one to think about how oneself and others are really operating, really, what their strategies are, whether they're intentional or aware or not.
and as I mentioned to you before in our just discussions before we started the interview, that morality was really the venue by which I came into looking at Alexander's work. It's pretty fascinating, but that's a whole. We can do another whole show on that actually. So let's continue on to this with this question of sociality. So we've got this situation where we could. Let's say our default might be sort of in a Christopher Baum sort of way. Our default is towards a kind of egalitarian cooperation, but we have the capacity, and people like Dan Ariely have showed us we will engage in free riding to various degrees if it suits our interests. So do we know anything about, and I'm pretty sure that in reading Alexander, he talks about such an adaptation existing, but I'm just wondering if you know anything about it. What is it? What kind of mechanism is it that we have that allows us to decide at any given moment, this is a cooperation moment, this is a competition or conflict moment? Do we know how that works?
Well, we've got very big brains.
Yeah.
Really hard, actually, to have that kind of question. And there are layers of consciousness and subconsciousness, an onion that really are not designed to come out with what's honestly going on in there, but again, to have a facade that is most effective at having others see us the way we want them to see us. So, you and I, if we're a normal human, firmly believe that we are good, moral, ethical. I mean, we have probably our little failures here and there, but it's
no, I'm sure
Lake
not.
Wobegon, we're all above average in terms of kindness.
That's right.
Decency, honesty, those kinds of things. And of course, it can't be true, but we worked very hard to have those reputations, and those reputations are really important. And being a parent, one of the things that we humans work very hard at is trying to help our children understand that there are long-term consequences to their actions. Reputations are important, and it's not just their personal reputation either. It's the family's reputation. It's the group's reputation, and so there's all that sort of social pressure to be, to present that kind, good person, ethical, moral face.
Yes. And yet,
and yet,
given the opportunity. So I'm trying. Let me give you an analogy, and you tell me if you think this analogy works. So I'm thinking, with a little bit I know about sort of biology of other animals, right? I'm thinking that there's a certain kind of a sort of kind of grazing animal, which has predators, is out there in the field, and it's it's grazing away, and everything's great, and then it detects the approach of a predator, and so these visual cues come in, it clicks off processes in the brain which got certain hormones firing, and I don't know what the hormones are, but it gives it a feeling of fear and a need to flee. Right? So I'm wondering, is there something like that? I'm not saying the same thing, but something like that we can identify that tells us, this is the opportunity to cooperate, and this, and we're acknowledging this is unconscious, right? That the veneer of being, an agreeable, egalitarian, cooperative fellow is all still there, but that allows us to, that level of unconsciousness allows us to make these decisions. Do we know anything about that?
Well, we know a lot about it in different.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, the various modern military training systems work very hard at trying to understand how to get a platoon, a squad, and higher levels to think and work as one, and in the extreme, not to desert. So, the simple selfish action of letting your comrade move forward while you cover behind him, so to speak,
right.
Or even turn tail and run when you think that you're going to put yourself at high risk by staying and fighting. It requires a lot of training to develop abilities to suppress those kinds of normal fears. And, likewise, economically. There's a lot of research done on how children learn, in effect, to respect ownership, the sense of property.
Mm-hmm.
That's just something that develops in every culture. Humans, wherever we find them, that sense of understanding rights of others.
Yeah, I always wonder how much of that is, and I'm totally going off the page here. I just wonder how much of that has to do with sort of Trevor's parent-child or parent-offspring conflict, and that sort of like be fair, share your stuff is sort of like the parent's way of assuring that the kid isn't overly demanding. The kid wants all the resources and the parent wants to split them up fairly between all the offspring, and that sort of like emphasis of sharing and being nice and don't hit your sister sort of thing. To what extent is that just the self-servingness of parents assuring that they're getting the best distribution of resources among the offspring? I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
We've done a bit of research on this in my work at my study site in Dominica over the past 28 years. And something that parents are really concerned with is not just how their offspring, brothers and sisters, divvy up resources and help each other out, but the external face of the family. So some ways, cheating, taking the last piece of pizza from your brother is less of a threat to the family than when that's done publicly to a
right.
So I mean, the parents are really concerned with the network of relationships that they have with other families in their community, and that their family is viewed as being a good family, an ethical family, responsible, moral family, because there are benefits to that. You get help. Yeah. Others will support you if you have that reputation.
So I'm going to wrap up, I'm going to want to ask you sort of a question about what if you can sort of summarize what you think is sort of the important lesson from Alexander. But before I do that, I want to give you mine and get your response to it. And I'm going to read you a quotation here, which I think is really beautiful. But it just as a preface to it, I'm going to say that when I first got interested in evolutionary theory, maybe half a dozen years ago, I was really struck by how, on the one hand, there's like this almost universal, I'm almost tempted to say knee-jerk sort of absolute endorsement. Of course evolution is true among sort of the general public, right? I mean, of course, we know there's exceptions, right? But at least in my circles, right? Almost everyone says, well, of course, you wouldn't even question evolution. But if you start talking about the evolution of human beings and, human nature and human society, then you get into all kinds of troubles. And obviously this goes back to E.O. Wilson in the 70s, and, it's been an ongoing theme. Now, the answer, when people who address this, and like Steven Pinker famously in The Blank Slate, and people like this who have addressed this issue, usually present it as, well, it's a political ideology thing, right? These people are afraid that biological explanations are going to conflict with their ideology. And it's not that I'm saying that's not true, but I think that Alexander had a more profound insight into that. So I'm going to read this quote, and for the listeners, this is from an essay called The Evolution of the Human Psyche from 1989, which also, I think, if you have some background in evolution, is a fantastic introduction to Alexander's thought. So he starts off by making the point that evolutionary theorists propose to explain the explainers themselves. And so here's the quotation. The difficulty of this proposition lies not only in the fact that some of the traits to be explained must be used in their own explanation, but also that one trait of the explainers is that they do not always wish to be explained, at least not too completely to anyone else, and that humans, more than any other species, are evolved to be exceedingly clever at deceiving other humans. Moreover, there may be no task of learning or teaching that is imaginably more difficult than that of bringing into the conscious items that have been kept out, not incidentally, but by natural selection, and most particularly by selection that has disfavored conscious knowledge of motivation as a social strategy. And to me, that quote explains so much about the resistance that one finds constantly to any talk about human social evolution. It's not incidental, it's not ideological, it's our very nature that we don't want this stuff to be revealed about us, us in person, or us, as a species by nature. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I agree completely. First, with your being so on point with identifying that issue and Alexander, the way he deals with it. So I don't know if I can put it in simpler terms, but a human that really acted towards others in ways and explained one's behavior to others in terms of evolutionary selfishness is not likely to be a very popular person.
That's right.
Not so much just on the sense of a resistance to evolutionary logic or anything, but one would view such a person as being designed, calculating their own self-interest over yours. Whereas someone who is, shall we say, naive or oblivious can put on a facade of being genuinely kind and pull it off much more effectively. So yeah, I would agree that with Alexander that we have a bias against thinking about ourselves in this kind of ultimately evolutionarily selfish logic. I just don't like to think of myself that way. I like to think that I am truly, genuinely a good, kind, helpful person. And it's almost ironic, but that is in itself the way to get ahead. That's like selfishness.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. The funny thing is that there's a real disconnect. Like if you explain to people that their love they feel for their children isn't evolved and it has a functional benefit, then it's like you're offending them, right? Like it doesn't change anything about the way you feel for your child. It just explains why you feel the way that you do, right? But there's just this disconnect that if you're going to explain it in those kind of terms, somehow you've pulled back the curtain and you don't want to see the man behind the curtain or something, right?
I agree. One might argue that a similar kind of evolved human obfuscation almost of that sort of thing is partly why religion is a universal. Mm-hmm. We really like to phrase why things happen, not in cold, hard, self-interested calculus, but softened, if you will, by the supernatural.
Well, that's my that's the lesson I've taken from Alexander. It's really influenced my thinking and my life, actually. And the point you made about being unpopular, that somehow resonated when you said that. So, so do you, to close, is there any lesson that you could say that you've drawn from Alexander, either personally or intellectually, that is of real importance, had a lasting impact for you?
Well, yeah, certainly. Just it has just guided both my research efforts, which focus a bit more on filling in the mid-level gaps, the mechanisms, the hormones, the cognitive structures that underpin the kinds of adaptive behaviors that Alexander argues for. Yeah, I think just how important it is that we understand how our evolutionary background is for us to solve the big problems that face humanity, whether they be environmental degradation or conflicts or terrorism. These are problems that have persisted and persisted and persisted. And, particularly the kind of evolutionary framework that Alexander has proposed offers some really important new insights into solving those kinds of questions. So, education about human evolution, understanding of our motivations, the real stuff that's deep down in us, that's arguably the key to getting to where we would all like to be in terms of a happier planet.
My guest today has been Mark Flynn. Mark, thanks very much for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Michael.
So that's today's show. Thanks for listening. The Biological Realist podcast is available on YouTube, but we'd encourage you to come to our homepage. That's Michael McConkey, Michael, McConkey, McConkey.com/The Biological Realist podcast. If you come there, you can find a full inventory of all the shows that we've done and show pages that give you more information on the various guests. Plus, you have the opportunity to support the show by either making donations or buying products through Amazon that at no extra cost to yourself can generate commissions that help us keep the show on the air. So thanks very much for listening, and watch out for us next time. We look forward to see you in the next episode of The Biological